We're really excited for our panel today. Once again, I'll introduce our panelists. We are joined by the film's directors, Barrett Goodman and Chris Durrance. Albert Flynn, the head of Common Cause, and reporter David Bailey, reporter in Boston. Barrick, I want to start with you. Obviously, our country is facing a lot of challenges at the moment, including challenges to our democracy, as we just saw. What was it about the issue of gerrymandering that inspired you to make this film?
Well, when we started, I knew very little about gerrymandering. But I had a sense, like most of us do, that there must be something going on underlying what we see, the sort of polarization and dysfunction in the government. What were the structural reasons for it? I had a sense that there was something wrong, and it wasn't until I read this man's book, which was a game changer for me, a book called Rat Fuck that Dave wrote, 2016? Yeah, I read it in 2016, and just opened my eyes to this problem. It was all about Project Red Map. And so we approached David, and he signed on to the project, and we were off and running.
So as this film well documented, this is a problem across the country, in towns like Flint, Michigan, and everywhere. But it can be a challenge to explain this to people and why it matters. So Chris, what was compelling to you about telling the story on film, and what did you find challenging during this process?
Exactly that. I mean, how do you bring something that is really the domain of poli-sci 101, and that's barely understood by most people, certainly not by us. How do you bring that to life? But once we started digging into what had happened in the swing states in particular, thanks to the beautiful reporting that Dave had done, and realized that things like Flint, that things like the bathroom bill in North Carolina, that so many things could be traced directly back to gerrymandering. It was as if the foundations of our political house, the political house that we all live in, as if those foundations were rotten. And for us, drawing those connections was key. And then the second thing was looking forward. We were in 2016 when we started out, but for us it was also important to figure out what was happening now. Red Map happened in 2010, we were living with its consequences, but what was happening in those states? And that took us to Michigan, that took us to Pennsylvania, that took us to Wisconsin, that took us to North Carolina, and it's there that we found the fantastic team of lawyers, Ruth Greenwood, Nick Stephanopoulos, all the folks at CLC, the local lawyers who led that Supreme Court case, and then of course Katie in Michigan, and that's when we really knew we had a film. We had something that could talk about 2010 and Red Map, but also the activists pushing back.
Yeah, I was going to say, Katie is phenomenal, and she gives me hope. What was it like when you discovered her? Because I can imagine you're probably like, oh, this is almost too good to be true.
Yeah, a little bit of that. She's the kind of character you dream about as a documentary filmmaker. We had a sort of circuitous route to finding Katie. And she appeared to us when we first saw her as sort of hopelessly naive, way in over her head. No way will this work. We actually thought the other group, Nick and Ruth and their team of amazing lawyers, were much more likely to succeed. They were so brilliant and had such a strong foundation for their case. But the more we stayed with Katie, the bigger this thing got, the more people who started to show up at their rallies and their volunteer events, the more we really began to realize that they were really onto something, that they had captured something cross-party lines that people were so frustrated by. And we began to fall in line and believe in it too. And by the end, we were pretty sure that they would prevail. Who was gonna turn their nose up at this particular message? And so we decided to kind of ride that wherever it went.
Yeah, and just one other thing, just as filmmakers, you watch the evolution of the film as it grew in the edit suite. I mean, you could see Katie coming further and further towards the front of the film, and it felt like she just called out to be right there at the beginning, right there as this spine that holds much of it together. So you could trace that evolution as we come to terms with what she's achieving on the ground in Michigan in the work that we were doing.
So as you all know, we're rapidly approaching the next census and the next round of redistricting. One issue that I know Common Cause has been working very hard on is ensuring the accuracy of the census. Karen, could you talk a little bit about the threats to an accurate census and why it's so important ahead of redistricting?
Sure. You know, it's a huge challenge. Already we have a challenge with a census that's done online, and a lot of people don't have access to be able to get online. More importantly, though, we've seen this administration work to get a citizenship question on the census. In fact, you saw earlier a picture of Thomas Hoffler, who was one of the red map drawers in 2010. He did an analysis looking at the impact of using census data with citizen voting age population. Just citizens and not total population, which we see how maps are usually drawn. Total population, including children and those who are not citizens, in part because the census doesn't just decide who's represented, it decides, you know, the infrastructure, hospitals and roads and schools and other things for communities. So it's about money that can come to a community, so it makes a difference. Thomas Hoffler drew a map in Texas, and he discovered that if you use citizen voting age population, you could benefit, as he said, non-Hispanic whites and Republicans. So basically, you can rig the maps before you even get to the redistricting, gerrymandering effort by using citizens' voting age population. Now, Thomas Hoffler's daughter went to Common Cause to get some legal help in North Carolina, and she knew that we had a Supreme Court case on gerrymandering called Common Cause v. Rucho at the Supreme Court, and she said, that case is over, so I wish I could give you my father's files because there's a lot of data in there about redistricting. And actually, David also got this data from Stephanie Hoffler. We had...
I'm not telling where I got the data from.
All right, that was my guess. Our attorney subpoenaed this data, and we got that map. We shared it with the ACLU, who had a case before the Supreme Court on a citizen question in the census. That, that data that showed the intent, we believe made a difference with Justice Roberts in that case that said no citizenship question on the census. We also have data that we are pouring through, our attorneys are, not us, to take out confidential documents and privileged documents, because Thomas Hoffler was involved in drawing maps in 45 states. This data could be helpful for cases around census to battle back against Republicans using citizen voting age population. It can be used in partisan and racial gerrymander cases, and also bail in under the Voting Rights Act. So when there are discriminatory laws that are passed to put voter ID or other things to restrict people's vote, this data cannot just allege what intent was. We believe that it will be able to show some of that intent and have a powerful impact on litigation for many years to come.
So, David, I want to talk about your last book, Rat Fucked, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. What a title. Also my husband's favorite book. I do have a copy here. He would like you to sign it. It was a definitive account of gerrymandering in the 2010 redistricting cycle that we talked about. So you have a new book coming out called Unrigged, How Americans Fought Back. So let's talk a little bit about your journey, about your new book, and what it's been like to go from a book diagnosing the problem to writing about and being a witness to the solution or potential solutions.
It's so much nicer. There's like a black cloud that's been lifted off of my head. I mean, it's funny. This book came out in the summer of 2016, and as you would imagine for a book about gerrymandering, it got a little bit of notice, and then it was over. And then on November 8th, 2016, something strange happened, right? The popular vote goes one way by 2.8 million votes, and the Electoral College goes another way, and 3 deeply gerrymandered states tipped the Electoral College by 80,000 votes. All of those states had done various ID or suppression tactics during that period of time. Americans woke up to a nation in which we were deeply divided, but all the political power was on one side. And I sort of said, hey, I've got a book that kind of explains how this might have happened. And people, so I went back out and talked about it a lot. And I would go into these rooms in which people were there with hope. They wanted to do something. And I was like, yeah, good luck. Let me tell you what's wrong. And I could feel sort of the air coming out of the room. And I'm like, I've got to find some hope for myself and for all of these people. And I mean, really, one of the big things was I went out on the paperback tour to Ann Arbor. And I did a reading in Michigan. And the Voters Not Politicians folks contacted me ahead of time and said, can we show up and collect signatures outside? And I'm like, absolutely. And I met them all, and I said, okay, there's something happening here. I think I had the same reaction, Chris and Barrett did. And I'm like, if this is happening here, this is happening elsewhere. And so I spent, a lot of 2018 on the road with a lot of different Katie Fahey's. And there are some of them in every state in the nation, and they're doing amazing work. I rode across Idaho in the Medicaid Express with these millennials who determined that they were going to expand Obamacare and bridge the Medicaid gap in this red state where the legislature had refused to do it for 6 years in a row. And they took this lime green RV out across the state and collected their signatures and won. 64% of the vote or something. I went down to Florida and followed the vote on felon reenfranchisement. 1.4 million people disenfranchised in Florida due to laws dating back to the Jim Crow era, designed to keep minorities especially from having access to the ballot box. And followed the gerrymandering cases around the country, and a lot of these other stories, the fight for student voting rights, Native American voting rights. And I can tell you that, I mean, Dr. King talked about an arc of the moral universe that's long but bends toward justice. There are people on the other side who are trying to bend it towards injustice, but the fight is on, the fight is back, and there are a lot more of us who are now sticking our hands on this arc and pulling as hard as we can.
That's great. I want to open it up to the audience, and I want to start with Trevor Potter.
Thanks very much. What a powerful film. It's really well done. David, we're looking forward to doing a book event for you, because I think your book is going to really make a difference, and it lays out this sort of citizen energy. So the question is, everywhere we have seen these ballot initiatives on redistricting, they pass. Michigan passed in almost every county, urban, rural. There was not a huge divide there. Utah, very Republican state, Republican Party opposes it. It still passes because citizens don't like gerrymandering, even if it's done by their party. But the other side of that is we then see the pushback from the legislatures, from these lawsuits that we now have in Michigan over this. And it's not just gerrymandering. You see situations where legislatures have come in to undo citizen initiatives on ethics reform, or states where the legislature comes in after citizens have passed initiatives and decides they don't like initiatives, and they're going to make it harder to get them on the ballot. So the question is, why aren't those legislators who are fighting the voters, even after the voters have spoken, why aren't they in more trouble? Why aren't they being punished for their battle against the popular will as represented in this?
Yeah.
That's it.
Is that the answer?
I will also say that as Common Cause actually works in many states to move ballot initiatives and gerrymandering reform. And in fact, in California, the first place, actually Arizona, way back, and in California, Citizens Commission, we really moved that. there needs to be resources to support groups on the ground to fight this. Any of us that pass reforms on money in politics or ethics or anything else know that incumbents will often come after it through litigation. And so having resources to continue to fight to protect those reforms is a critical part of the equation. And a lot of people come in for the exciting part for the ballot initiative. And what we need to be doing is building the capacity to be there on the ground, to fight the litigation that happens, to fight at midnight behind closed doors when legislators go and they try and gut this, so that we have crowds of people there, the media ready, and you're fighting back. This is a key component. And you know, the truth is, I passed a big reform on money in politics when I worked at the state level, and in a lot of ways, it felt like the baby I had to raise. I thought, wow, huge win. We were sued immediately afterwards. And then legislators tried to tinker with it. So I had to fight, and we passed it in 2005. We had to do a fix in 2006, one in 2007. They went after it in 2008, 2009, 2010, 11, 12, and 13. Still working on it to ensure that it's viable. And the truth is, many legislators have come into using this new system. And now a lot of the old timers who fought it are gone. And so part of it is you have to recognize that democracy is an everyday event, and that you have to be there after the fact when the cameras leave and continue that fight, because that's when they're going to come for it. And it can be done.
Great. Any other questions? Please state your name, affiliation, and a brief question. Can you wait for the microphone, please? Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for bringing this film. It's great. I've read Rat Fuck twice now. No real affiliation. I do volunteer with the League of Women Voters. But you may know that on Friday, the Virginia legislature passed the constitutional amendment to have a redistricting commission. They're still wrangling on the enabling legislation. I think that's going to be discussed on Thursday. We have Chris Jankowski living in Richmond. We had our Democratic delegates push back against the amendment. They were on board last year when they were in the minority. We had an election and they're in the majority. So now it has to go to voters. What can good government groups do, like the League of Women Voters, to ensure that voters do pass it, and that when we get the commission, that we don't have some of the dirty tricks that we've seen illustrated in this film? What can we expect? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Follow Katie's example. I mean, their proposal was something like this thick, what ultimately was passed. And I think this much was the definition of what it would do, and that much was the defense. It was basically trying to game every single attack, talking to people in California, talking to people in Arizona, the best lawyers in the country, lawyers for CLC, for the Campaign Legal Center, where Trevor Potter is the director, I believe, and other experts, because as you said, the attacks will just be relentless. But I think once you get out to the people and explain in clear language what the stakes are and what is involved, then I think that work will pay off.
I'll just say one other thing, that I do think the environment is different now than it was when we did this film and Dave wrote his book. I think thanks to David and others like him, this practice isn't as cloaked in secrecy and sort of behind the scenes as it used to be. And people do know what gerrymandering is, not everyone, but enough that politicians who try to get away with it are going to be a little bit more cautious. I mean, maybe that's naive and overly optimistic, but I do think that they'll hesitate, because I think, to answer Trevor's question, that they may face some repercussions in the ballot box if they take it too far. So hopefully we're seeing that in Virginia. Maybe that's why the Virginia Democratic majority didn't resort to gerrymandering themselves, and instead looks like they're going to have a citizens commission. I think that there is a feeling maybe that the era of egregious gerrymandering is a little tougher than it used to be. I would like to hear your thoughts about that.
I think they're going to move on and play different games. I think citizen voting age population is the thing we've really got to have our eyes on as this next decade emerges. I mean, that one simple change that Karen talked about so eloquently has the ability to roll back decades of demographic change in a state like Texas or Georgia or Arizona, simply by means of who and how you count. Can change the nature of political power in a state for another 20 years. I think you will see that the technology that we thought was so good in 2011 that made such a step up over 2001 with the data and the technology that was available is going to be even more perfect heading into this next time. And a lot of the gerrymanders from this last cycle were just so obvious looking, Donald Duck kicking Goofy. When the map in Pennsylvania got thrown out by the Supreme Court in 2018, you had, so first it went back to the Republican legislature and they were allowed to draw it again. And they came back with this much prettier map. And when the mathematicians took a look at it, they realized that this map might have been prettier and it might have held more communities of interest together, but it was every bit as toxically gerrymandered as the old one. And I think that that's what you're going to see, is that the technology will be better, that there will be even more slippery techniques. And I think that Democrats have sort of caught up on the idea that state legislatures matter, right? So you see all of these groups that are very active now, Run for Something and Flippable and Sister District trying to get Democrats elected into Congress. You've got Holder's, into state legislatures, and Eric Holder's group doing the same kind of thing and trying to wake up after they fell asleep last time. Republicans aren't going to be playing the same game in 2021 that they played in 2011. They've moved on. There's going to be different techniques, and they're going to be more insidious. And we're going to have to be just as observant.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing? One of the challenges with these democracy reforms is we have to remember that there are times Democrats do it too. Not as egregious as the Republicans, but Virginians were for it, the Democrats were for it when they were in the minority, and then they get power and they think, this would be so much better. What if we do it? And so it is. And actually, I've seen Democrats be bad on election bills that break down barriers to people participating. Why? Because they know how to get to 50+1. It's easier. If you add all these people, now how am I going to win? And so we have to hold all of them and their feet to the fire on these issues. And I agree, the battle is going to be around the citizen voting age population, and technology, as a judge said in North Carolina, has incredible power, because they can cut and dice these districts with unbelievable precision in a way that they couldn't years ago, and so that makes it much more dangerous.
The beauty of this film and the beauty of what happened in Michigan and Idaho and Florida is that these reforms pass with mid-60s, 70% of the people. That doesn't happen if these reforms are seen as partisan. Most Americans see these as basic fairness.
That's right. We have time for one last question. The gentleman in the back of that. And a reminder that the film is out on April 3rd in theaters and on video on demand. Tell your friends.
Hi, my name is Stephen Spitz. I live in Virginia, and I hate to sort of throw cold water on some of your assumptions. The Virginia Constitutional Amendment does not provide for an independent Citizens Commission. And that's part of the problem and the confusion about it. It is not, there is no citizens initiative in the state of Virginia. So there's no ability for Virginians to actually do something without getting the legislature. So the legislature has this sort of, it's still confusing, it hasn't been resolved yet. So my question is, how do you get an initiative process in a state that doesn't have one, like Virginia?
Good luck. I mean, that requires politicians to give up that power. And as Trevor suggested in his question, that's been moving the other way around the country. It's harder and harder to get a ballot initiative on this in the states where it's possible to use the initiative. It's become increasingly more difficult to do that. State legislatures have dramatically increased the number of barriers between citizens and their ability to do that. They've increased the number of signatures you need, the percentage of people you need, the number of counties you have to pull it off in. It is extraordinarily hard. And I think that's why I would say that while the Virginia bill is imperfect, because the legislature has to be involved, it's not going to get any better than that. And politics is still the art of the possible, and it requires compromise. And this compromise that was happening in Virginia was the only way to make change ahead of this next round of redistricting, and citizens will at least have a seat at the table. It's not perfect, but it's better than it would be.
There's also other tools as well. You know, one of the things we've used, if you can't get reform, is citizens mapping process, where you bring in the public to draw maps, different kinds of maps. One of the things we found as we bring litigation, working with different attorneys in different states, many times judges, they don't want to appoint a special master, they don't want to draw the maps themselves, they will take maps. And in fact, it was League of Women Voters maps in Florida that the judge used when there was litigation around the standards that they had and how some of the legislature ignored the standards. In New York State as well. So citizen mapping can be a powerful tool, as can litigation. We are seeing, and the Supreme Court in the Kamikaze v. Rucho partisan gerrymander case said that you can have the state courts weigh in on this, and we saw that when we won in the Kamikaze v. Lewis case in North Carolina, and then Holder's group brought it for congressional maps. So for the first time in 10 years, North Carolinians will be voting in 2020 under fairer maps than they have in the last decade. So litigation is still a powerful tool as well.
And Pennsylvania as well. I mean, the biggest
Pennsylvania
victory.
in 2018.
The biggest victory was probably Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And that was a state court action. So about half the states have stronger constitutions than the federal constitution in terms of protecting voting rights. And so that's a very active course to take. And then about half the states have these ballot measures. So in lots and lots of states, there are possibilities. And I hope that the example of California, the example of Virginia, the example of Michigan, and Utah and Oklahoma and states and Missouri, that states you wouldn't necessarily associate with this, are going to provide models and also inspiration to citizen activists, but also to legislators to see what's possible, and it's not the end of the world when they make those changes.
I want to please everyone join me in thanking this wonderful panel. You all for attending. You can learn more about Center for American Progress's work in this space by visiting AmericanProgress.org, and everyone have a good evening. Thank you.
We'll be outside if anyone has any other questions.